Officers harassed an elderly black woman on her porch, but when her son arrived, their faces. In the quiet neighborhood of Oakwood, nestled on the outskirts of a bustling Midwestern city, lived Margaret Johnson. At 78 years old, Margaret was a pillar of her community, known for her warm smile, her famous peach cobbler, and her unwavering strength in the face of adversity. Her modest one-story home, with its meticulously maintained flower beds and gently creaking porch swing, stood as a testament to a life well lived and the generations of love that had passed through its doors. Margaret had called Oakwood home for over 5 decades, having moved there with her late husband Robert in the late 1960s. They were among the first black families to integrate the neighborhood, facing years of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination with dignity and determination. Together, they had raised 3 children and watched as the neighborhood slowly, if imperfectly, became more diverse. Now a widow for nearly a decade, Margaret found joy in the simple pleasures of life, tending to her garden, volunteering at the local community center, and doting on her grandchildren. Her son Michael lived just across town with his wife and 2 kids, visiting his mother every Sunday without fail. Michael Johnson, at 45, had followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a respected civil rights attorney. His work often took him to high-profile cases across the country, fighting against systemic racism and police brutality. While Margaret was immensely proud of her son's accomplishments, she couldn't help but worry about the toll his work took on him and the potential dangers he faced. Unbeknownst to Margaret, the tranquility of her beloved Oakwood was about to be shattered. The neighborhood had been experiencing a series of break-ins over the past few months, causing tension and fear among the residents. The local police department, under pressure to solve the cases, had increased patrols in the area. On a warm Saturday afternoon, as Margaret sat on her porch enjoying the gentle breeze and working on her crossword puzzle, she had no idea that her peaceful world was about to collide with the harsh realities her son fought against every day. The events that were about to unfold would not only test Margaret's resilience, but would also shine a glaring light on the deep-seated issues of racial profiling and police misconduct that still plagued their community. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Margaret's well-manicured lawn, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change lives, challenge perceptions, and force an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about race, power, and justice in America. The serenity of the late afternoon was abruptly shattered by the sound of a police siren, its wail cutting through the quiet neighborhood like a knife. Margaret looked up from her crossword puzzle, her brow furrowing in concern. She watched as a patrol car pulled up in front of her house, its lights flashing ominously. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, their hands resting casually on their holstered weapons. Margaret felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach, memories of past encounters with law enforcement flooding back. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had nothing to fear. This was her home, her sanctuary. "Good afternoon, officers," Margaret called out, her voice steady despite her growing unease. "Is there something I can help you with?" The officers approached the porch, their expressions a mix of suspicion and authority. The older of the 2, a stocky man with graying hair and hard eyes, spoke first. "Ma'am, we've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Margaret blinked in surprise. I live here, officer. This is my home." The younger officer, a lanky man with a close-cropped haircut, narrowed his eyes. "We're going to need to see some identification, ma'am." A flicker of indignation flared in Margaret's chest. "My identification? Young man, I've lived in this house for over 50 years. I don't carry my ID to sit on my own porch." The older officer's stance stiffened. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe that a suspect in a series of local break-ins may be in this area. If you can't provide identification, we're going to have to ask you to come down to the station with us." Margaret's heart began to race. She knew her rights, knew that she wasn't obligated to provide ID on her own property, but years of experience had taught her the dangers of challenging authority, especially as a black woman. "Officers, please. This is clearly a misunderstanding. If you'll just allow me to go inside, I can retrieve my driver's license." Stay where you are, the younger officer snapped, his hand moving to his weapon. Keep your hands where we can see them. The situation was escalating rapidly. Margaret felt a surge of fear and anger. I've done nothing wrong, she said, her voice trembling slightly. This is my home. You have no right to treat me this way. The older officer stepped onto the porch, looming over Margaret. Listen, lady, we don't know who you are or what you're doing here. For all we know, you could be the burglar we're looking for. Now you can either cooperate, or we can do this the hard way. Tears of frustration welled up in Margaret's eyes. She thought of her son, Michael, of the stories he told her about police overreach and racial profiling. Never in her wildest dreams did she imagine she would find herself in such a situation, treated like a criminal on her own property. As the officers continued to press her, their voices growing louder and more insistent, Margaret noticed her neighbors beginning to peer out of their windows. Some had come out onto their own porches, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and concern. She felt a deep sense of humiliation wash over her. Please, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. My son is a lawyer. If you'll just let me call him. Enough, the older officer growled. Stand up, you're coming with us. As the officer reached for her arm, Margaret felt a surge of panic. She pulled away instinctively, her elbow knocking over the small table beside her, sending her crossword puzzle and glasses clattering to the porch floor. The reaction was immediate. Both officers lunged forward, roughly grabbing Margaret's arms. Stop resisting, the younger one shouted, twisting her wrist painfully. Margaret cried out in pain and fear. I'm not resisting. Please, you're hurting me. The commotion had drawn more attention. Neighbors were now gathering on the sidewalk, some calling out in protest, others filming the incident on their phones. But the officers seemed oblivious to the growing crowd, focused solely on subduing the elderly woman they perceived as a threat. As Margaret found herself being forcibly pulled from her porch, she closed her eyes, silently praying for help. Little did she know, her prayers were about to be answered in a way that would send shockwaves through the entire community. The sound of screeching tires cut through the chaos on Margaret's porch. A sleek black SUV came to an abrupt stop in front of the house, and out stepped a tall, imposing figure. Michael Johnson, Margaret's son, had arrived on the scene, his face a mask of controlled fury. Get your hands off my mother! Michael's voice boomed across the yard, causing the officers to freeze in their tracks. As Michael strode purposefully towards the porch, the officers' faces underwent a remarkable transformation. The younger one's eyes widened in recognition, while the color drained from the older officer's face. They knew exactly who Michael Johnson was. Mr. Johnson, the older officer stammered, immediately releasing his grip on Margaret. We didn't realize. Didn't realize what? Michael interrupted, his voice cold with barely contained anger. That you were manhandling an innocent elderly woman on her own property? Or that she was my mother? The revelation sent ripples through the gathered crowd. Whispers spread rapidly as neighbors recognized the famous civil rights attorney who had made national headlines for his work against police brutality. Michael reached the porch and gently put his arm around his shaken mother. Are you okay, Mom? He asked softly, his eyes scanning her for any signs of injury. Margaret nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. I'm all right, baby, just scared. Turning back to the officers, Michael's expression hardened. I want your names and badge numbers. Now. The officers, now visibly nervous, complied without hesitation. The older one, Officer Benson, attempted to explain. Sir, we were responding to reports of suspicious activity in the area. Your mother couldn't provide identification. Stop right there, Michael cut him off. Are you telling me that an elderly woman sitting on her own porch in broad daylight constitutes suspicious activity? And since when is it a crime to not carry ID on your own property? The younger officer, Taylor, shifted uncomfortably. We were just following protocol. Protocol? Michael's voice dripped with sarcasm. Is it protocol to use excessive force on a 78-year-old woman who posed no threat? Is it protocol to ignore the constitutional rights of citizens based on the color of their skin? The gravity of the situation was beginning to dawn on the officers. They had unknowingly accosted the mother of one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country. a man known for taking on high-profile cases of police misconduct. As if on cue, several news vans pulled up to the scene, alerted by neighbors who had recognized Michael. Reporters began to set up cameras, sensing a major story unfolding. Michael turned to address the growing crowd, his voice carrying across the now silent street. What happened here today is a perfect example of the systemic racism that continues to plague our justice system. My mother, a respected member of this community for over 5 decades, was treated like a criminal in her own home simply because of the color of her skin. The revelation of Margaret's identity and her son's prominence had transformed a routine police call into a potential landmark case. As cameras flashed and reporters clamored for statements, the officers stood frozen, the full weight of their actions beginning to sink in. In that moment, as Margaret leaned on her son for support, surrounded by neighbors and media, it became clear that this incident would have far-reaching consequences. The story of an elderly black woman harassed on her own porch was about to become a rallying cry for change, challenging not just a local police department, but the very foundations of law enforcement practices across the nation. In the days following the incident, Margaret Johnson found herself at the center of a media storm. Her story had gone viral, with footage of the confrontation captured by neighbors spreading rapidly across social media platforms. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of racial profiling and police overreach. As Margaret sat in her living room, surrounded by the comforting presence of her family, she wrestled with a difficult decision. Michael, still seething with anger over the treatment of his mother, was pushing for a lawsuit against the police department. "Mom, we have a real chance here to make a difference," Michael argued passionately. This case could set a precedent, force real changes in police training and accountability. Margaret listened to her son, her heart heavy with the weight of the choice before her. On one hand, she was deeply hurt and angered by how she had been treated. The memory of those terrifying moments on her porch, feeling helpless and humiliated, still brought tears to her eyes. Part of her wanted justice, wanted to ensure that no one else would have to experience what she had gone through. On the other hand, Margaret was a woman who had lived through the civil rights era. She had seen firsthand the progress that could be made through peaceful protest and bridge building. The thought of being at the center of a contentious legal battle, of potentially deepening the divide between the police and the community, gave her pause. "I don't know, Michael," she said softly. "Is a lawsuit really the answer? Maybe there's another way, a way to create understanding rather than more conflict." Michael looked at his mother in surprise. "Mom, these officers violated your rights. They humiliated you in front of your neighbors. How can you not want to hold them accountable?" Margaret reached out and took her son's hand. "I do want accountability, baby, but I also want change. Real, lasting change. And I'm not sure a lawsuit is the way to achieve that." After days of soul-searching and discussions with her family, Margaret made her decision. Instead of pursuing a lawsuit, she would agree to meet with the police chief and the officers involved, on the condition that the meeting be part of a larger community forum on police-community relations. The consequences of Margaret's decision were immediate and far-reaching. News of her choice spread quickly, drawing mixed reactions. Many praised her for taking the high road, for seeking understanding and reconciliation rather than retribution. Others, including some in the black community, criticized her for not pushing harder for justice, arguing that her approach was too soft on a system that needed radical change. The police department, caught off guard by Margaret's unexpected move, agreed to the community forum. The event was scheduled for the following month, giving both sides time to prepare. As the day of the forum approached, Margaret found herself thrust into a role she had never anticipated, that of a community leader and mediator. She spent hours meeting with various groups, listening to their concerns and hopes for the future of police-community relations in Oakwood. The forum itself was a tense affair. Held in the high school auditorium, it drew hundreds of attendees from across the city. Margaret sat on stage alongside the police chief, the 2 officers involved in the incident, and several community leaders. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret rose slowly, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger as she addressed the crowd. "What happened to me was wrong," she began. "It was hurtful, it was unjust, and it highlighted the very real problems that exist in how our community is policed. But I stand before you today, not seeking vengeance, but understanding. Not division, but unity." She turned to face the officers who had accosted her. "I want to know why. I want to understand what led you to look at a 78-year-old woman and see a threat. And I want to work together to ensure that no one else in our community ever has to feel the fear and humiliation that I felt that day." Margaret's words had a profound impact on the audience. The raw honesty of her pain, combined with her call for reconciliation, moved many to tears. Even the officers who had arrived defensive and wary found themselves visibly affected by her speech. As the forum progressed, heated debates gave way to more constructive discussions. Ideas were proposed for improved police training, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, and programs to foster better relationships between law enforcement and the community. By the end of the night, while no easy solutions had been found, a dialogue had been opened. Margaret's decision to seek understanding rather than retribution had created a space for honest conversation and the possibility of real change. As she left the auditorium that night, leaning on Michael's arm, Margaret felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. She knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult process. But she also knew, deep in her heart, that she had made the right choice. The path to healing and justice would be challenging, but it was a path she was prepared to walk, one step at a time. While Margaret's story had captured national attention, a secondary plot was unfolding in Oakwood that would have significant implications for the community's future. Jason Reynolds, a 17-year-old high school student and aspiring journalist, had been one of the neighbors who witnessed the incident on Margaret's porch. Disturbed by what he had seen, Jason decided to dig deeper into the issue of policing in Oakwood. Armed with his smartphone and a determination to uncover the truth, Jason began interviewing residents about their experiences with local law enforcement. What he discovered was a pattern of racial disparities in police interactions that had gone largely unreported. Jason's investigation led him to the Oakwood Police Department's public records. With the help of his history teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, he began analyzing arrest data, traffic stop statistics, and complaint records. The numbers painted a troubling picture. Black residents of Oakwood were disproportionately targeted for stops, searches, and arrests, even though they made up a relatively small percentage of the population. As Jason delved deeper, he uncovered something even more disturbing. There appeared to be an unofficial quota system in place, pressuring officers to make a certain number of stops and arrests each month. This system, Jason realized, could be a driving factor behind the over-policing of minority communities in Oakwood. Excited by his findings but unsure of how to proceed, Jason reached out to Michael Johnson for advice. Michael, impressed by the young man's initiative and thorough research, agreed to meet with him. "Jason, what you've uncovered here is incredibly important," Michael said, reviewing the teenager's notes. "This could be the key to understanding why incidents like what happened to my mother are so common." Encouraged by Michael's support, Jason decided to turn his investigation into a series of articles for the school newspaper. With Miss Rodriguez's guidance, he crafted a compelling narrative that combined personal stories from Oakwood residents with the hard data he had uncovered. The first article in the series was published just days before the community forum. It sent shockwaves through Oakwood, providing concrete evidence of systemic issues within the police department. Many residents, particularly those in the white community, were shocked by the revelations. Others, especially in communities of color, felt vindicated. Finally, there was proof of what they had long suspected. The police chief, under pressure from the mayor's office, was forced to acknowledge the issues raised in Jason's article. He promised a full internal investigation into the unofficial quota system and a review of departmental policies. As the community forum approached, Jason's work had added another layer of complexity to the discussions. It was no longer just about one incident with Margaret Johnson, but about addressing long-standing, systemic issues within the Oakwood Police Department. This secondary plot served to broaden the scope of the story, highlighting how Margaret's personal experience was part of a larger pattern of racial discrimination. It also introduced a younger perspective to the narrative, showing how a new generation was using technology and data analysis to fight for social justice. Jason's investigation would continue to play a crucial role as the story unfolded, providing a factual backbone to the emotional and personal elements of Margaret's experience. His work would become a rallying point for those seeking concrete reforms in Oakwood's approach to policing. In the midst of the turmoil following the incident, an unexpected relationship began to develop between Margaret Johnson and Officer Sarah Taylor, the younger of the two officers involved in the confrontation. Initially, Sarah had been defensive about her actions that day, but as she watched Margaret's graceful handling of the situation and her call for understanding rather than punishment, something shifted in the young officer's perspective. After the community forum, Sarah approached Margaret, her posture tense with nervousness. "Mrs. Johnson," she began hesitantly, I wanted to apologize. What we did that day was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Margaret studied the young woman's face, seeing genuine remorse in her eyes. "Thank you, Officer Taylor. That means a lot to me. But I have to ask, why? Why did you and your partner react the way you did?" Sarah's answer was honest and revealing. She spoke of the pressure to meet unofficial quotas, the constant stress of the job, and the unconscious biases that had been reinforced through her training and experiences on the force. This conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Margaret, drawing on her years of experience as a teacher before her retirement, saw in Sarah an opportunity to create real change from within the police department. Over the next few weeks, Margaret invited Sarah to her home for tea. These meetings became a space for open, honest dialogue about race, policing, and community relations. Sarah shared her experiences as a female officer in a male-dominated field, while Margaret spoke of her experiences living through the civil rights era and the changes she had seen and those still needed. As their relationship deepened, Sarah began to see her role as a police officer in a new light. She started to question practices she had previously accepted without thought, and to speak up when she saw fellow officers engaging in potentially biased behavior. Margaret, in turn, gained insight into the challenges faced by police officers. While it didn't excuse the mistreatment she had experienced, it helped her understand the systemic issues that contributed to such incidents. Their growing friendship did not go unnoticed. Some in the community, particularly those who wanted to see harsher consequences for the officers involved, criticized Margaret for being too forgiving. Others, however, saw it as a powerful example of reconciliation and the potential for personal relationships to drive institutional change. Michael, initially skeptical of his mother's friendship with Sarah, gradually came to see its value. "You're doing what I do in the courtroom, Mom," he said one evening. "But you're doing it heart to heart, person to person. Maybe that's just as important as legal action." The relationship between Margaret and Sarah became a symbol of hope in Oakwood. It showed that bridges could be built even in the aftermath of painful incidents, that understanding could grow from conflict. As the weeks passed, their conversations expanded to include others. Sarah began bringing fellow officers to meet with Margaret, creating informal dialogue sessions that helped break down barriers between the police and the community. Margaret also introduced Sarah to other community elders, particularly those from minority communities. These meetings provided Sarah and her colleagues with perspectives they had never been exposed to in their training or daily work. The impact of these relationships began to ripple through the police department. Officers who had participated in the dialogues reported feeling more connected to the community they served. They were more likely to engage in community policing practices and to approach situations with a greater awareness of potential biases. For Margaret, the friendship with Sarah was healing. It didn't erase the trauma of what had happened, but it gave it meaning. She felt that her suffering could lead to positive change, not just through policy reforms, but through changed hearts and minds. As the story of their unlikely friendship spread, it inspired others in Oakwood to reach across divides of race, age, and profession. Community members began organizing dialogue groups, bringing together people who might never have interacted otherwise. What had started as a terrible incident on Margaret's porch was transforming into a movement of understanding and reconciliation in Oakwood. And at the heart of it was the growing friendship between an elderly black woman and a young white police officer, proving that even in the darkest moments, the potential for human connection and growth remains. The climax of the story unfolded 3 months after the initial incident, during a town hall meeting called to discuss proposed reforms for the Oakwood Police Department. The high school auditorium was packed, with tension thick in the air as various stakeholders prepared to present their views. Margaret Johnson sat in the front row, flanked by Michael on one side and Officer Sarah Taylor on the other, a visual representation of the bridges that had been built. The police chief, looking uncomfortable, sat on the stage alongside the mayor and several community leaders. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that despite the progress made, deep divisions remained. Some community members demanded the immediate firing of all officers involved in racial profiling incidents, while others defended the police and resisted any significant changes. The situation reached a boiling point when Jason Reynolds took the podium to present his findings on racial disparities in policing. As he outlined the data showing clear bias in stops and arrests, a voice from the back of the auditorium shouted, "That's a lie! You're just trying to make the police look bad." The outburst came from Officer Benson, the older officer involved in Margaret's incident. He had been suspended pending an investigation but remained bitter and defensive. The auditorium erupted into chaos, with shouting matches breaking out across the room. The mayor tried unsuccessfully to restore order as the months of tension finally boiled over. In the midst of the uproar, Margaret slowly rose from her seat. Despite her age, she stood tall, her presence commanding attention. As she made her way to the podium, a hush gradually fell over the crowd. "I have seen this before," Margaret began, her voice strong and clear. "I have seen communities torn apart by fear, anger, and misunderstanding, but I have also seen them heal." She paused, looking out over the sea of faces, black and white, young and old, civilians and police officers. "What happened to me was wrong, but what's happening here tonight is wrong too. We're letting anger and fear drive us apart when we should be coming together." Margaret then did something unexpected. She called Officer Benson to the stage. The man who had been one of her tormentors that day on the porch came forward reluctantly, confusion evident on his face. "Officer Benson," Margaret said, looking him in the eye, "I forgive you, not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to anger won't create the change we need. I invite you to join us in building a better Oakwood." The auditorium was silent, the tension replaced by a collective holding of breath. Officer Benson stood frozen for a moment, then, in a voice choked with emotion, said, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Johnson. I want to do better." It was a transformative moment. The simple act of forgiveness, offered publicly and sincerely, broke through the anger and defensiveness that had dominated the discourse. Margaret then turned to address the entire auditorium. This is where change begins, not in pointing fingers or assigning blame, but in acknowledging our mistakes, forgiving, and working together to do better. We have a choice to make tonight. We can let this incident divide us further, or we can use it as a catalyst for real, lasting change in our community. As Margaret finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause. The atmosphere had shifted palpably, from one of confrontation to one of cautious hope and determination. In that moment, it became clear that Oakwood stood at a crossroads. The path forward would not be easy, but Margaret's act of forgiveness had opened a door to possibility that had seemed closed only moments before. In the wake of Margaret's powerful speech and act of forgiveness, the town hall meeting took on a new tone. The mayor, seizing the moment, proposed the formation of a special task force to address the issues of racial profiling and police reform in Oakwood. This task force, the mayor announced, will be co-chaired by Mrs. Margaret Johnson and Police Chief Robert Anderson. It will include representatives from the police department, community leaders, and experts in civil rights and law enforcement policy. The proposal was met with cautious optimism from most attendees. However, some voices of dissent remained. A group of younger activists led by Jason Reynolds expressed concern that the task force would simply be a way to delay real action. "With all due respect to Mrs. Johnson," Jason said, standing up to address the crowd, "we've seen task forces before. What we need is immediate action. We have the data. We know what's happening. Why can't we implement changes now?" Margaret then did something unexpected. She called Officer Benson to the stage. The man who had been one of her tormentors that day on the porch came forward reluctantly, confusion evident on his face. "Officer Benson," Margaret said, looking him in the eye, "I forgive you. Not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to anger won't create the change we need. I invite you to join us in building a better Oakwood." The auditorium was silent, the tension replaced by a collective holding of breath. Officer Benson stood frozen for a moment, then, in a voice choked with emotion, said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Johnson. I want to do better." It was a transformative moment. The simple act of forgiveness, offered publicly and sincerely, broke through the anger and defensiveness that had dominated the discourse. Margaret then turned to address the entire auditorium. "This is where change begins, not in pointing fingers or assigning blame, but in acknowledging our mistakes, forgiving, and working together to do better. We have a choice to make tonight. We can let this incident divide us further, or we can use it as a catalyst for real, lasting change in our community." As Margaret finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause. The atmosphere had shifted palpably from one of confrontation to one of cautious hope and determination. In that moment, it became clear that Oakwood stood at a crossroads. The path forward would not be easy, but Margaret's act of forgiveness had opened a door to possibility that had seemed closed only moments before. In the wake of Margaret's powerful speech and act of forgiveness, the town hall meeting took on a new tone. The mayor, seizing the moment, proposed the formation of a special task force to address the issues of racial profiling and police reform in Oakwood. This task force, the mayor announced, will be co-chaired by Mrs. Margaret Johnson and Police Chief Robert Anderson. It will include representatives from the police department, community leaders, and experts in civil rights and law enforcement policy. The proposal was met with cautious optimism from most attendees. However, some voices of dissent remained. A group of younger activists, led by Jason Reynolds, expressed concern that the task force would simply be a way to delay real action. "With all due respect to Mrs. Johnson," Jason said, standing up to address the crowd, "we've seen task forces before. What we need is immediate action. We have the data. We know what's happening. Why can't we implement changes now?" Margaret listened to Jason's concerns with a thoughtful expression. "Jason," she replied, "I understand your frustration. I feel it too. But lasting change doesn't happen overnight. This task force isn't about delay, it's about making sure we get it right. We need everyone at the table if we're going to create solutions that work for our entire community." Over the next few weeks, the Oakwood Community Police Relations Task Force began its work. Meetings were held in various locations around town, from the police station to community centers in predominantly minority neighborhoods. The goal was to ensure that all voices were heard, and that the task force's recommendations would reflect the needs and concerns of the entire community. One of the first issues tackled was the unofficial quota system that Jason had uncovered in his investigation. Chief Anderson, under pressure from both the community and city leadership, admitted that while there was no official policy, there was an unspoken expectation for officers to make a certain number of stops and arrests. "This stops now," the chief declared during one of the task force meetings. "We will be implementing a new performance evaluation system that focuses on community engagement and problem solving, not on the number of citations issued or arrests made." This announcement was a significant victory, but it was just the beginning. The task force grappled with a range of complex issues, from implicit bias training for officers to the creation of a civilian oversight board. Heated debates often erupted, with deep-seated beliefs and long-held grievances coming to the surface. Margaret found herself in the role of mediator, using her natural empathy and the respect she had earned from both the community and the police department to bridge divides and find common ground. Her friendship with Officer Sarah Taylor proved invaluable, as Sarah was able to provide insight into the perspective of rank-and-file officers and help translate community concerns into actionable policy recommendations. One of the most contentious issues was the handling of complaints against officers. Community members pushed for greater transparency and accountability, while the police union representatives argued for protecting officers' rights and privacy. After weeks of negotiation, a compromise was reached. A new civilian review board would be established with the power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. However, final decisions would still rest with the police chief, who would be required to publicly explain any decisions that differed from the board's recommendations. As the task force's work progressed, small but significant changes began to be implemented. The police department started hosting regular community forums in different neighborhoods. A youth advisory council was formed to provide input on police-youth relations. Officers began receiving enhanced training on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. However, not everyone was satisfied with the pace or extent of the changes. Some community members felt that the reforms didn't go far enough, while some police officers grumbled about increased scrutiny and what they perceived as a lack of support. Tensions came to a head again when a draft of the task force's final recommendations was leaked to the press. The document included proposals for significant changes to use of force policies, a requirement for officers to carry liability insurance, and a reallocation of some police funding to community-based crime prevention programs. The leak sparked a new round of heated debates in the community. Supporters hailed the recommendations as a bold step towards meaningful reform, while critics accused the task force of going too far and potentially endangering public safety. Margaret, exhausted but determined, called for calm. These recommendations are a starting point, not an ending. She said in a statement to the press, "We knew from the beginning that this process wouldn't be easy. Change never is. But I believe in this community. I believe that we can come together, listen to each other, and find a way forward that makes Oakwood safer and more just for everyone." As the task force prepared to present its final recommendations to the city council, the people of Oakwood held their breath. The coming weeks would determine whether the hard work of the past months would result in real, lasting change, or whether old divisions would reassert themselves. The path to resolution remained uncertain, but thanks to Margaret's leadership and the efforts of countless community members, there was hope for a better future. The presentation of the task force's final recommendations to the Oakwood City Council marked a crucial turning point in the community's journey. The council chambers were packed, with overflow crowds watching on screens set up outside City Hall. The atmosphere was tense, with supporters and critics of the proposed reforms anxiously awaiting the outcome. Margaret Johnson, despite her fatigue from months of intense work, stood tall as she addressed the council. Her voice, firm and filled with conviction, carried throughout the room as she outlined the task force's vision for a more just and equitable Oakwood. These recommendations, Margaret concluded, represent not just the work of our task force, but the hopes and dreams of our entire community. They offer us a path forward, a chance to heal the wounds of the past and build a better future for all of Oakwood's residents. As the council began their deliberations, it became clear that the decision would not be easy. The proposed reforms were far-reaching and would require significant changes in how the police department operated. Some council members expressed concerns about costs and potential pushback from the police union. It was at this moment that an unexpected voice spoke up. Officer Sarah Taylor, who had been sitting quietly in the audience, stood and asked for permission to address the council. "As a police officer," Sarah began, her voice shaking slightly, "I want to say that these changes are not just necessary. They're long overdue. Working on this task force has opened my eyes to the real problems in our community, problems that we as a police force have sometimes contributed to. These reforms will make us better officers and help us truly serve and protect all members of our community." Sarah's heartfelt testimony, coming from within the ranks of the police department itself, proved to be a turning point. After hours of debate, the city council voted to adopt the majority of the task force's recommendations, with a commitment to phase them in over the next year. As the vote was announced, a wave of emotion swept through the crowd. There were cheers, tears, and sighs of relief. Margaret, overwhelmed by the moment, found herself embraced by Michael, Jason, Sarah, and many others who had been part of this long journey. The adoption of the reforms marked a new direction for Oakwood. The real work of implementation lay ahead, but there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. The community had come together, faced its challenges honestly, and chosen a path of progress and reconciliation. For Margaret, it was a bittersweet victory. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but she also knew that Oakwood had taken a vital step towards becoming the kind of community she had always believed it could be. In the months following the adoption of the police reforms, Oakwood underwent a period of significant change and reflection. For Margaret Johnson, this time was one of deep personal growth and contemplation. Sitting on her porch one warm evening, Margaret found herself marveling at how much had changed since that fateful day when 2 police officers had confronted her in this very spot. She had gone from a victim of racial profiling to a catalyst for change in her community. The journey had been exhausting, challenging, and at times painful, but also profoundly rewarding. Margaret reflected on how the experience had changed her. She had always considered herself an engaged citizen, but this ordeal had awakened a new level of civic responsibility in her. She had discovered reserves of strength and leadership she didn't know she possessed. At 78, when many of her peers were slowing down, Margaret felt invigorated by a new sense of purpose. As the 1-year anniversary of the incident approached, Oakwood had become a different place. The police department, under new leadership and guided by the implemented reforms, was working hard to rebuild trust with the community. Community police forums were now regular events, attended by both officers and residents, eager to maintain open lines of communication. Margaret Johnson, now affectionately known as Mama Margaret by many in the community, continued to be a guiding force in Oakwood's ongoing transformation. Her story had become a powerful reminder of how one person's stand against injustice could spark widespread change. The themes of resilience, forgiveness, and the power of community had become woven into the fabric of Oakwood's identity. Margaret's journey from victim to leader exemplified the potential for growth and positive change, even in the face of adversity. As Margaret sat on her porch, watching a group of children, black, white, and brown, playing together in the street, she felt a sense of peace. The work was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted and were beginning to flourish. The story of Oakwood served as a beacon of hope for other communities grappling with similar issues. It showed that with courage, compassion, and commitment, it was possible to confront deeply rooted problems and emerge stronger and more united. As the sun set on another day in Oakwood, the porch where it all began stood as a testament to the transformative power of standing up for what's right, the importance of building bridges across divides, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.